Kristin Gilkes. I am the Executive Director of the Customers First Coalition, and the Electric Wire is a production of the Customers First Coalition. I want to give a quick shout out to our members. The members of the Customers First Coalition are the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin, Dairyland Power Cooperative, the IBEW 2150, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, Renew Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Electric Cooperative Association, and WPPI Energy. And I am very excited to have with me today one of the board members of the Customers First Coalition, Tom Content, who is the Executive Director of the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, Kristin, great to be here. Thanks for having me join the fun on the Electric Wire.
Tom, there has been so much energy industry news in Wisconsin and nationally this week. It's been hard to keep up. There are a few headlines I wanted to go over with you. We wanted to focus on some recent news about the coal plant closure in Portage, Wisconsin. This is the Columbia Energy Center. The announcement from Alliant Energy is that Columbia Energy Center will close by the end of 2025. I want to get a quick high-level reaction. What did you think when you heard this news?
I thought it's just amazing how rapid the transition is happening. It's a transition that we've been knowing was coming and sensing was coming, and the utilities have these carbon reduction goals, but it's striking how quickly this is all happening. With the Columbia announcement that we are expecting it to actually be shut down, part of it in 2023, part of it in 2024, and as you said, entirely gone by 2025. The challenge is this affects not just one utility, but three of our main utilities in Wisconsin rely on this for round-the-clock energy right now. So it shows how quickly everything is transforming in front of us.
I was going to mention that. So one of Customers First Coalition's members, Madison Gas and Electric, is a part owner of the Columbia Energy Center. Their emissions profile will benefit from the closure of the coal-fired Columbia Energy Center.
Yeah, it's a big deal. They clearly customers want cleaner energy sources, and I think you're seeing shareholders pressing utilities for cleaner energy sources, whether it's religious shareholders that care about climate change that have mobilized, whether it's environmental groups, but even more, it's Wall Street, big investment houses and shareholders are pushing. They sense that it's a carbon constrained world that is ahead of us, and that utilities that need to move faster in that direction. It creates challenges from a customer point of view when you try to do a rapid transition, especially after Wisconsin invested a lot over the years in a lot of new generation over the last decade or so, and so it doesn't make it easy for the customers when we as the customer group look at the rate competitiveness challenge versus other states.
Another major energy announcement this week, as WEC Energy Group and co-owner Madison Gas and Electric announced that they would be investing in the Paris Solar Battery Park in Kenosha County, the largest of its kind facility in Wisconsin. The facility will feature 200 megawatts of solar generation, which they say is the equivalent to powering 60,000 homes, and 110 megawatts of battery storage, which can store solar generated power and discharge it when the sun goes down.
So that's a big announcement, and we've been following the battery sector through the electric vehicle space for a while, and just seeing the first major battery storage project now on the books and being proposed for Wisconsin is significant. The question from the customer point of view is how much have those battery prices fallen, and is it ready for prime time from a cost effectiveness standpoint? But this, batteries are the key to when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. Batteries are what a lot of people are pinning their hopes on. going forward. So this is really, it all makes for a big month so far in the energy world.
As this process moves forward, CUB and other stakeholder groups will have a chance to evaluate this application more closely. The company just submitted this application to the Public Service Commission. If approved, construction is expected to begin in 2022, and the project would be scheduled to go into service in 2023. And I should note that the project is being developed by Invenergy, and later on the podcast, we'll be joined by Dan Litchfield of Invenergy, and he talks more about this project. The other piece of news I wanted to touch on here is earlier this week, the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin announced a requirement for utilities to file workforce diversity and affordability data. According to their press release, all regulated utilities will be required to provide workforce diversity data as part of the utility's 2020 annual report. The PSC will also require privately held utilities with at least 15,000 customers to provide information about supplier diversity and procurement goals and actual spending for women-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned, disability-owned, and LGBT businesses in the previous calendar year, and the utility's plan for implementing and realizing their goals for the following year. I think this is good news. This is more information. This is useful information on the utilities, procurement, and hiring practices. Of note, and CUB actually put out a press release on this as well. In addition, the same investor-owned utilities with at least 15,000 customers will be required to provide a detailed household economic burden index analysis. This analysis shall evaluate residential energy and residential water utility customer bills as percentages of household income by county. What are they trying to get at here, Tom?
So really, it's really exciting. The whole one of those adages you hear a lot is you can't manage what you don't measure, and this is where this area is where this is really important. So when it comes to household energy burden, everybody knows that Wisconsin has pockets of poverty, right, in certain areas. But what we don't know at a really detailed level is how that intersects with your energy bills and how in different parts of the state we don't have information. Wisconsin has, as the Public Service Commission has only had until now, basically more of a statewide or utility-wide look at affordability. And this can be the platform to actually have innovative programs and pilot projects targeted at either certain areas of the state or certain utilities, whether it's rural areas or urban areas down the road. So once you have the data, you can come back and say, oh, we should try this in this area, or try that, try this, try X or try Y. And this is something CUB has been talking about, and we actually got commitments from several utilities already, including the WEC utilities and MGE, to actually, and we're hoping that in the future we can even go beyond a county-wide energy burden look to even a census tract level, just to really zero in on where the folks who are struggling the most are, and then seeing what their energy patterns are too, and kind of taking that data together, seeing what can be done to address. We've got longstanding economic inequality challenges, but you've also got COVID kind of magnifying challenges for customers. So this, as part of our work on behalf of the low income subset of customers, we were excited to see this move forward.
The other piece of recent news was in the introduction of the governor's budget. The governor's budget addresses a number of climate change proposals, many of which resulted from recommendations of the governor's climate change task force that finished up work at the end of last year. So there are a number of provisions dealing with green jobs, electric vehicles, the cost of carbon. There's a lot to unpack in there. I know one of the items you're working on this legislative session that it gets a mention in the budget as well, but there's also separate legislation, Tom, and that's the PSC Omnibus Bill. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's in there and why that's so important to CUB?
Sure. So in the omnibus bill and in the budget, we hope it'll move forward in the omnibus bill even faster. Is a proposal that will essentially enable the consumer advocate, in this case, in Wisconsin's case, CUB, to have more stable funding and actually be able to engage more with the utilities on an ongoing basis as we work on rate cases. So one of the challenges Wisconsin's had, or the customer advocate CUB has had, is that Wisconsin passed a settlements law a couple of years ago that encourages stakeholders like us to negotiate across the table from the utilities instead of just, pound on the table and fight all the way to the end of a rate case process. And that changes the game for how we do our work essentially. And so now, instead of relying on outside consultants that we can't actually get funding for in these settlement cases, it allows us to actually have more personnel on staff who will have an ongoing, deeper understanding of each utility and how they work. So essentially, it's a consumer advocate funding proposal to keep funding stable for CUB, and to ensure that as a consumer advocate, we're there to level the playing field when the PSC makes decisions with the utilities on one side and us as the advocate for the residential and small business customers on the other. It's an interesting development because what Wisconsin is unique, one of the only 2 states in the country where they only rely on a small nonprofit CUB to do this work. Most states have an attorney general's office or some state agency that does this work. And Wisconsin decided, well, let's not make that a government job. Let's go with this independent model. And this is paramount to making sure we can keep that independent model going forward.
Last energy news item, what is going on in Texas?
And we're going to be talking about this for a long time. What really happened in Texas? The fact that so many people, the entire state was gripped by the freezing temperatures, the snow, and a massive failure of the entire power system, natural gas, coal, oil, wind, it all stopped working at the same time and left millions of people without power, without heat, struggling. This is going to have ramifications that we can't predict here this week on this podcast, but I think we can't not talk about this if we're talking about the energy news of the week.
Our hearts go out to them. There are plenty of resources you can find online of ways to help right now. There are warming shelters and food pantries and other organizations stepping up. I have to say, I'm glad Wisconsin has the effective regulation that we do. I'm glad that we have planned for our future energy needs the way that we have. I'm glad that we have the reliable energy we do. That's what it comes down to for me. I never want us to get into a situation like that. And I think we've done a decent job of planning in this state to make sure that we are prepared for those times when we need energy the most.
I think it just underscores the importance of energy to life. We've seen that through the pandemic, where the importance of just staying connected has been during the pandemic was important for our Public Service Commission to keep folks from being shut off last summer. But this just shows how integral this energy is to everything. We live that, but now everybody's living it, and now everybody's seeing what's going on in Texas and wondering, will that happen here? So I think that we'll be, as I said, we'll be analyzing this and looking for lessons, both for Texas, but seeing if there are lessons that could be applied down the road.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about each of the guests we brought on. And then there's a couple terms we talked about with this group that I wanted to make sure we're able to explain a little bit more fully before we get into the interview. So the roundtable that we've got to discuss coal plant closures and the clean energy transition includes Todd Stuart, who is the executive director of the Wisconsin Industrial Energy Group. And Todd's group represents some of the largest energy users in Wisconsin. And these are utility customers, but unlike Cub, who also represents customers, Todd's group really focuses on the larger energy users. And you guys, Tom, really focus on residential and small business customers. Am I right?
That's right. And the simple way to think about it is because we work with Todd and then we work with WIG, and then sometimes we work against WIG. So the simple way to think about it is you're eating a piece, you think of the whole electricity system as a chocolate cream pie, right? Who doesn't like pie? When we work together with WIG, we're trying to make the pie smaller so there's less, so the low rates are lower for everybody. But then there's always a phase 2 of the process, and that's who gets the most pie, or in this case, the pie of how much customers have to pay has to be divvied up between large customers, medium-sized customers, small customers, and so that's where we can butt heads at times when it gets to divvying up the pie, but we're on the same page when it comes to bringing down the size of the pie.
Right. And you'll hear this later when you hear our conversation with Todd. He mentions he didn't want to not get invited back on the Customers First Coalition podcast. Customers First, as many of you who listen to the podcast know, we oppose any attempt to deregulate or bring about a retail choice model in Wisconsin. We support the effective regulation of Wisconsin's utilities. There are different models in other states. One of the states we talk about later in the podcast is Texas. We also mention our neighbor to the south, Illinois, and Ohio also is a deregulated state. In total, there's only about 13 states that are actually deregulated. Some other states have sort of a hybrid model, like a cap on larger energy users who can choose their provider. But in general, most states do follow the regulated utility model, similar to what Wisconsin has. And we believe that offers protection for customers. Todd, obviously, you'll hear more in that interview, but his group may have a slightly different perspective on some of these issues. But as I was telling Tom before we started, I don't want to make this podcast just an echo chamber. So we did want to bring in other voices and make sure you're hearing from many different stakeholders on this podcast. We also are joined by, in this roundtable, Scott Smith, who is an assistant vice president at Madison Gas and Electric, overseeing regulatory strategy, as well as joined by Dan Litchfield of Invenergy. And I mentioned earlier that Invenergy is a renewable energy project developer, and they are in the process of developing this Paris solar storage project for WEC Energy Group and Madison Gas and Electric.
Invenergy is also building Badger Hollow, which is another solar farm that is co-owned by the same 3 utilities.
Thank you. Okay, so that's who's on the panel. And then there were a couple terms that I wanted Tom to help clarify, just so that we're all on the same page. Tom, give us your best definition of securitization.
So securitization is a term that's been around in the utility industry, actually linked to that whole deregulation process years ago, but it's now being talked about in the context of retiring coal plants. And so essentially, securitization is a form of refinancing. So instead of a utility earning its full profit on this sum of money, you refinance it to a lower rate. And securitization is a process to do that, by which you actually sell bonds, ratepayer-backed bonds that are actually outside the utility itself. And Wisconsin actually has a law in place, and that is now just been used for the first time with a decision that came in December, which it's called the Environmental Trust Financing Law. So that's the form of securitization that we have here in Wisconsin, and it's being used in the context of the We Energy's Pleasant Prairie plant.
Thank you. The other term I wanted to make sure we get a good definition of, since it comes up in the roundtable, demand response.
Right. So demand response is really the change in power consumption that happens when a customer on a hot summer day when demand is spiking, when a customer reduces their energy use or significantly curtails that, so that supply and demand can remain in balance during a peak energy event.
Perfect. Thanks. I think you're all ready then to listen to this roundtable discussion on coal plant closures and the clean energy transition. We'll turn you over to that now. I'm happy to be joined today by an outstanding panel of guests. We have Todd Stuart, who is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Industrial Energy Group. Welcome, Todd. We have Scott Smith, who is the Assistant Vice President of Business and Regulatory Strategy for Madison Gas and Electric. We are joined by Dan Litchfield, who is a renewable energy project developer for Invenergy. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. We're chatting today about the closure of the Columbia coal plant. And since I have you all here, I'm interested in just getting a high-level perspective. What's your organization's take on this plant closure? Scott, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, Kristin, as you know, MGE has been an owner of the Columbia Energy Center, along with our partners at that plant, Alliant Energy, who's the owner-operator, and Wisconsin Public Service Corporation. And it's really been a workhorse for a number of years, providing energy to all of our customers. But when we were looking at kind of the, what the long-term value is, it just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to continue to invest in that asset when we had opportunities to invest in other resources, primarily wind and solar. Just as the costs have come down, it's made those really more attractive than continuing to invest in a plant such as Columbia.
Thanks, Scott. How about you, Todd? What were your thoughts when you heard about this?
Yeah, well, and if you'll permit me, maybe to take the liberty of expanding it just a little bit further, because you said big picture, and I think the big picture is even bigger than Columbia. Obviously there's a lot of technological change going on at a very rapid pace, and there are just a number of other items in Wisconsin energy world and in the country. So I just wanted to back up a little bit and just to say there's a lot of things going on with the pace of technological change and the costs, but also just Wisconsin's unique picture. I mean, we're a manufacturing state. We're number one or number two for manufacturing, number one for paper. We used to have low rates. We haven't for a long time. And there are a number of drivers that are coming up this year. I mean, we've got these plants closing down, but also new plants coming in, and folks behind on their utility bills, their arrears from COVID and things like that. All the net zero goals that we do have, so that means new CapEx and new infrastructure, including transmission. So you got all these things going on. At the same time, you have the tax credits, the federal tax credits. They're pretty much all refunded. So you got a lot of things going on, and all's being equal, you're looking at a rate increase, this year or next year for most utilities, period. So anyway, I just want to lay the table that there's a lot of stuff going on. And then, so now you have this issue of Columbia, but you also have other coal plants announced retirements recently. There would be Saldo Creek, Edgewater, MGE has some smaller plants, Pub Service has some older natural gas plants. There are several units that are going to retire soon in the next couple of years. And I think my organization, some of the largest energy consumers in the state, and CUB, I can't speak for Tom, can pile on later on with his view of the world. I think both WEC and CUB, though, from the customer side, we're nervous. We don't really want to pay twice for assets that, building the new infrastructure, but also paying for infrastructure and a return on equity or a profit for assets that were supposed to last decades longer. That, some of this equipment, was just literally built for almost $1 billion that, was just over the last decade, and now we're going to shut it down just a few years later. So, we really have a hard time, in our view, paying twice for assets, and a lot of states are looking at securitization or other methods to help lessen that pain, or other methods to help, again, ease the burden on customers in a time when rates are probably going to start going up here pretty soon. So again, maybe more background than you wanted or needed, but I thought having a bigger picture would be helpful other than just Columbia.
Thanks, Todd. Tom, was there anything else you wanted to add in on that?
I think Todd really hit on a lot of good points. I mean, I think one of the things that makes Wisconsin unique in this issue is that Wisconsin has just come through a big investment period in building new plants, building new coal, natural gas, wind, and now solar, and investing and spending billions to invest to keep older plants going. So in the case of just Columbia alone, to narrow it right back to Columbia, you've got about 800 million or so of pollution controls that were added over the last 10-ish years. And so there's still about $1 billion left to be paid off that would have been spread over a long period of time if the plant were still running for under kind of the original plan before the utilities shifted abruptly to this decarbonization and zero carbon mentality.
Dan, you work for Invenergy, which is a energy developer. You are working on several projects right now. What is your reaction, and how are you responding to news of the Columbia plant closing?
I was surprised it was the date that was announced. I figured it was kind of a matter of time with that and many other older plants, but this is pretty soon. So there's an opportunity to do a generator replacement, which could save some time compared to the current interconnection process. I have a project I'm working on in Minnesota where we applied to connect to the grid in August of 2017, and we're on track to get our interconnection agreement by the end of this year. So this is about a 4.5-year process for a new connection. That takes a long time. When you have, MISO has a generator replacement process, so it may be possible to try to replace the generation from Columbia with another source of energy, and you can avoid the new MISO interconnection process. So we'll see. And we're hard at work on a number of clean energy projects in Wisconsin, and going to be pairing storage with our solar projects. And the combination of the two will boost their capacity, which is important to replace plants like Columbia. And I totally understand the concerns about we're paying for assets twice. I'm optimistic that folks like Scott can make the case that there's significant savings possible in the cost of energy from new solar plants, for example. And that should open up, I think, a pot of money that will help with some of those early retirements.
All right, we have been reading headlines this week about massive power outages in Texas. There have been millions of people without power for days. What is your reaction? How can we prevent something like this in the future to protect the people who rely on power, especially in situations with severe weather?
Sure, I can talk just a little bit from a Wisconsin perspective. Obviously we are at MGE we experience difficult weather conditions. Our assets are really hardened and developed to withstand some of the issues that we saw in Texas. It's just a matter of they don't experience this type of weather as frequently as we do. We did have this past week, -20s, and it's difficult sometimes to get some of your resources running, but once you get them running, they're, if you can usually maintain them through the period. And a lot of that is really, when we look at kind of the Wisconsin regulatory model, and kind of, as the regulators are always looking to us and asking us questions, how are you prepared for these types of things? What is your reliability? How is this going to, impact your customers if something like this were to occur? And so, we report back on them, whether it's, on a distribution system, which wasn't the issue down in Texas, it was more of the generation and freeze-offs. But whether it's power plant reliability, we'll get questions on that if that's an issue. Whether it's some underperforming circuits, we'll get questions from the regulators on that. So we have a system that kind of puts those checks on us to ensure that we're providing that type of service that we want to provide our customers, but our regulators also want to ensure that we're providing.
And just to draw the distinction there, Texas has a deregulated energy market, whereas Wisconsin's electric providers are regulated by the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. Todd, Dan, Tom, any other reactions to that? What caused and what could prevent a situation like this?
I think you really gets back into that. That's what's your regulatory model and how is it working? And Texas, with the deregulated model, is really having some challenges here. They're also having challenges because they're an island with their own transmission setup that essentially ends at their state border, whereas Wisconsin's part of a network that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rockies when it comes to transmission. But I've heard stories this week of, with the retail, the fact that there is competitive providers of electricity, that there are some cheap providers out there that are basically charging folks $9 a month plus the going rate of electricity. That may be fine in every other month of the year, but this week it's off the charts in terms of the going rate of electricity. And so some folks who are on those kind of plans with those companies are in real dire straits, even with their pocketbooks, even after they warm up and are able to get their faucets and houses back in shape and their lives back together. But I think one of the lessons is, I remember when the Packers were in the Super Bowl 10 years ago, it was 2011 and it was in Dallas, and they had rolling blackouts then. And there were some nuclear plants offline and some other things offline. And it turned out that national reliability folks, coordinators and FERC put out a report saying, you've got to fix some of these problems and make investments. But in this deregulated setup, there's no incentive. If I make the investment and my prices go up, then as a utility, then folks will just go to look for cheaper power and go to the cheaper alternative. So there's no incentive to make those needed investments to shore up reliability. So it's early days in this thing, but those are some of the early thoughts.
Todd, your reaction.
Well, first of all, I think we are going to be dissecting this for quite some time, kind of like we did with, the polar vortex a couple of years ago, or even perhaps more recently, the derechos in the Midwest and Iowa and things like that. So, these are really preliminary thoughts, and I'm somewhat reluctant to weigh in here just because, things we say in this podcast may sound a little silly in 6 weeks or 6 months or things like that. Not just because I'm probably more market friendly guy on this panel. It's more that I think we're going to be doing best practices or other root cause type analysis later on. I will say, so I have members all across the country, some in Texas, some throughout, obviously throughout the country, throughout the South and throughout the Midwest. And quite literally, sometimes there is a guy somewhere often in the South that's got a dial that with their mega plants will dial up and dial down production here in Wisconsin and other states based on the energy price. And so I've been trying not to bother some of those guys this week because they've had other fish to fry if they're in SPP and things like that, or Texas. So I will say this, number one, MISO North held up fairly well. As far as we can tell, prices were not great. Prices were painful for those of us, and most of my members are on real-time rates. Prices were painful this week, but some of that is a good thing. The demand response and those on real-time rates, those who can curtail, I think we may find that it was quite effective this week. So MISO North held up well, other than high prices. Other states that are dereg or market restructure, whatever word you want to call it, Ohio, Illinois, again, I don't think that they had the problems that you saw in the South. So, there may be a rush to pile on market restructuring, but there are Illinois and Ohio, I don't think had some of those problems. Subject to check. Again, we're going to be studying this for a long time. I'd also say for some of my folks that are in Texas, their tariffs, their prices are much lower than they are here. Also they can, for those that are into renewable type products, renewable tariffs, there's a lot of flexibility in deregulated states that we don't have here for some of the renewable products. So most of my members are in multiple states, and they can give you a printout of the prices they pay here versus elsewhere. And for a long time, because we wanted to address reliability 20 some odd years ago, our rates have been awfully high for the last 20 years. We've been some of the highest rates in the Midwest. So I just, those of us who've been through this business and seen cycles and different emergencies over the years, I would caution that under our regulatory model, we've been having high rates for about 20 years now.
So what do you think Texas is going to have to do in response?
Well, I just don't, I tend to, again, subject to, some perspective on this, obviously they're not used to having these kind of temperatures and weather at this time of year. And they're probably well suited for hot summers, but not very cold winters like this. So I'm sure you will see a lot of, how do we adjust our markets and things like that, and ERCOT reform. But again, I am a little cautious to pile on too hard one way or the other, because I do think we're going to be studying this for some time.
I agree with you on that. Dan, did you have any reaction? I know there were some commentators trying to blame renewable energy for this crisis in Texas. I mean, what is your reaction, and how are you answering some of those questions?
I'm staying off Facebook as much as I can. Some of my colleagues who are from Texas and Oklahoma were asking me, how do I respond to this? The picture of the helicopter spraying hot water on a wind turbine blade. I'm gonna go with Todd, and let's just wait and see how this shake out with the benefit of time. What I did read was that there were 34 gigawatts of generation that did not appear as planned, and 4 of that was wind. So wind has some role in this, but when you have weather that anything is not designed for, whether it's a power plant, it may not work. Just before this call, I was drilling holes in my brand new basement ceiling because there's water dripping in because of all the snow on the roof. So things, when you have extreme weather, things operate differently. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Scott, I'm going to ask you, as you make decisions in transitioning your generation portfolio throughout this clean energy transition, how do you make sure that these decisions benefit all of your customers?
Well, thanks, Kristin. I think really when we're looking at making these investments, we're looking at how can we do this in the most cost-effective way. And we've kind of conducted, what I'll kind of refer to as phase 1 of our transition. We've constructed and are now operating the Saratoga wind farm. We worked with Dan and his company on Badger Hollow. That's coming online, and we've got Two Creeks Solar. And so we've really kind of already made some of these investments, and now we're going to make some additional investments. Just earlier this week, we announced that we're looking to buy a project that Dan was involved in again at the Paris solar and battery storage facility. We're going to, partner with some other utilities. We're going to have a 10% stake in that. And really, that's where those batteries come into play, where, how can we better utilize this interconnect, which is, as Dan talked about earlier, is really valuable. And how do we, if solar is producing energy 24% of the time, how can we better utilize that? And the answer is really that battery component. And really, allowing us to put energy onto the grid at hours when the sun isn't shining, and really, kind of bringing that further along throughout the day. So that's really some of the value that we're seeing. And as we're looking at kind of the prices, that's where it's now making sense. When we initially made our investments in Badger Hollow, we said, we'd like to consider storage, but it wasn't at that price point at that time. But now we're kind of looking at this and saying pairing solar with batteries makes a lot of sense. So we're pursuing that as a way to kind of help all of our customers through this transition.
Thanks, Scott. Tom and Todd, I want to ask you, do you think that there are policies in place now or policies needed that provide financial protection for customers as utilities shift these long-term generation strategies?
So one of the challenges we see is as we talked about, there's still all this money to be owed on Columbia, and what are the tools that could be in place for that? And so what CUB and WEC were able to reach an agreement with on a different coal plant, Pleasant Prairie, was to refinance a portion of those costs. So through what the process known as securitization, we were able to basically lower the interest rate on the costs for the already shuttered Pleasant Prairie plant over in Kenosha County. And so that is through Wisconsin's environmental trust financing law. And as far as additional tools, basically that law allows you to refinance the pollution control costs, but there are other states that have been looking seriously at securitization, including Colorado and close to home Michigan, Minnesota, that in case where you can actually refinance the entire remaining cost to a lower rate. And so that's something that the governor apparently has now included in his budget proposal. But that's not to say that's the only tool that's out there, but that's one of the ones that could be explored to help, from our perspective, make the clean energy transition more affordable for everyone.
I guess if that's my turn, then, I would say, I would echo a lot of what Tom had mentioned. I think, again, the retiring a power plant, just after you put almost $1 billion into it, just a few years later, and decades before it's fully depreciated, I don't think anybody contemplated that. And so, there's a lot of, the way our regulatory model is set up in Wisconsin, there's a lot there. You have rate setting, you have the CA or CPCN process when you build a new project, but the lot is relatively silent when you decommission something, when you retire something. And, I think there could be more done to help consumers as part of that retirement process. So as he mentioned, securitization is one route you can go, and broadening securitization beyond just the environmental controls, the pollution controls. Knowing that securitization is a tough sell for our utility friends. It is often anathema to them to do securitization. Are there other things you can do to soften that pain of building all the new stuff, yet what do you do with the old stuff? You can, we have seen in other jurisdictions where the utility may take a haircut in trading for regulatory certainty levelize those costs and then spread them out over a longer period of time, as a way of again, lowering the burden for their customers in those regulated markets. So, and it could very well be by the time that some of these plants are retired, not just Columbia, South Oak Creek, or some of the other plants that you do see in our surrounding states, that they either use securitization or some of these other creative financing to help lessen the burden on the customers and on the ratepayers.
Dan, I'm going to shift to you. Can renewable energy really begin to take the place of coal?
Can renewables take the place of coal? Yes, I believe they can, and I think they will. Not in one fell swoop, because a lot of the remaining coal plants are pretty large. And as far as physically locating the renewables at the coal plant, the CPCN process in Wisconsin has a really robust section on site selection and how we need to defend why we've chosen a site. And so any good solar site, for example, you got to have good access to the grid, which the coal plants are going to have. But there's a lot of other factors such as environmental resources in the area, terrain, topography. And I think most of the coal plants in Wisconsin are not going to be great for that. You've got the plants like Dairyland's plants on the west side along the river, in coulee country where it's very rolling terrain, and that does not make for great solar construction. Or some of the more urban plants in Milwaukee, where you just don't have the physical space. Columbia might be about as close as we can come to a site, but like right near the plant itself is not going to be great. But I'm really proud of the Paris project, and there's going to be a lot more discussion about that with the ongoing certificate of authority process. But I think with our utility customers here, we've presented a really unique project that has a very sizable battery. And so for one, we've got the solar generation that is going to show up during the day when there's more demand for energy and there's higher value for that. And then we're also going to have this large battery that allows us to ensure the delivery of solar energy when it's needed, but also to shift it into the late afternoon, early evening when it's even more needed. And so that's important. And we can pair, it's kind of it's not a great analogy, but a lot of different technologies. Solar, storage, those are really important for that capacity piece. Wind energy is a great source of energy, bulk amounts of megawatt hours at low cost. And then the fourth piece of the future stool is going to be transmission. And we are embarking on a wind development in Wisconsin, but for the most part, our wind development is further west where there's a much stronger wind resource. And so if we can tile those together, yes, I think there's a bright future there. And there's going to be other technologies that are kind of dreams right now, but are going to need more advancement and can be implemented, like widespread. To one of your question, I think we'll talk about later about batteries in cars, electric vehicles. The reason we're able to present the large battery at Paris now is because the growth in demand for lithium-ion batteries due to electric cars, which is creating this manufacturing at scale, which is lowering the cost for all uses, including utility. So I think the future is bright.
Scott, that is one of the questions I was going to ask you. I know MGE is super supportive of electric vehicles, and as you support this strategy to electrify everything, are we going to be able to supply enough power reliably?
Yeah, I think electric vehicles are really an opportunity for utilities and customers to provide benefit. When you think about an electric vehicle, as Dan talked about, it's a battery. And so, when you come home from work, or, when we used to go into the office, maybe we'll be doing that again soon, when you commute back and forth, when you go into your garage, you might not need your vehicle until, say, 6 a.m. in the morning, right? And so you can then, if the utility can then determine when is the optimal time to charge that vehicle, from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m., there's real cost savings there. you know, when you think about other uses for electricity, whether it's Todd's customers who are, you know, manufacturing a product, they need that electricity now. Or whether it's a residential customer who goes into a room at night and turns on the light, they need that electricity now. A car doesn't necessarily need that electricity right now. And so that's really that opportunity to, you know, is there a way where, you know, for example, if you have 2 electric vehicles in your house, instead of charging them both right at 6 o'clock in the evening, when we're hitting that peak, what if we, you know, waited until 9 or 10 at night, and then we could trickle charge them, you know, throughout the night, and you know, everyone benefits because we're reducing the overall demands on the system, but the customer gets the same charged vehicle in the morning. That's really this opportunity we're seeing with electric vehicles, to really provide that managed charge, which will not only benefit the customer who participates in it, but all of the other customers.
Hey, Scott. Okay, Tom.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question on the Paris. This is the first big project we're seeing with utility scale storage, and you know, it's obviously the lithium ion trend. We've been following those battery prices have been following with economies of scale. But you know, as people think about replacing bigger forms of generation, how much more energy do you get? In other words, in the Paris example, you know, how many does it get you a certain amount of time after the sun sets? And what are we really looking at from the batteries here? Since it's the first time we've seen something on this scale in Wisconsin.
I'm not sure if this is answering your question, Tom, but the proposal, I believe, is a slightly over 4 hours of battery storage. So this is something that I'm learning as well. But you know, we talk a lot about solar generation, wind generation, coal, whatever, in terms of megawatts. That's power output, and we can do that with batteries as well. But we also need to talk about energy in terms of megawatt hours. So the analogy we use is, think of a big battery as a tank of water. The size of the pipe that the water comes out is your power, or your megawatts. And then the size of the tank, so how long it can run out for, is your energy, or megawatt hours. And so the proposal for Paris is a 4-hour system. So that would be capable of discharging 110 megawatts for 4 straight hours.
Todd, as we talk about this transition to renewables and battery storage to provide more of this base load source, what is your members' reaction to that? What questions do they ask you about reliability when we talk about the clean energy transition?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, don't take this the wrong way, but Wisconsin's been overbuilt for so long that you know, I'm not sure people realize that supply and demand is relatively balanced in the coming years, that depending on the cadence or the timing of when stuff is retired and when new stuff is built, you know, and sales growth, you know, we're getting a little bit closer to our planning reserve margin for some utilities, depending on which utility you're talking about. So some of this is pace and timing, and sales growth. I mean, I don't know. Our state's overall peak demand has been roughly the same since 2005 or 2006. I think that's remarkable, that we've been relatively flat for you know, a generation or so, and COVID is going to probably extend that even longer. And so you know, not to be a broken record, but large customers are frustrated that rates have exceeded the Midwest average, national average, for quite some time, and reliability measures for the state are not all that different. They're pretty close to our surrounding states. So we're kind of playing a reliability premium, yet our reliability is not orders of magnitude greater than surrounding states. So with a little bit of that as background, I'd say there is some skepticism over replacing large baseload generation with the capacity factors of intermittent resources. Some of it depends on, your source of news that you consume at home. Quite frankly, I'm not trying to be funny necessarily, but that does factor into it. So there are, but replacing, this is a change in mindset. And so replacing large baseload units with intermittent sources that is a bit of a concern. I also have some member companies that are very concerned about the cost of batteries. Hopefully Dan and Scott can help them get over that. But I have a few that are freaking out over what they think of the cost of the battery may be, and as mentioned earlier, there is a short-term cost. No matter what, even if the long-term benefits and long-term savings make sense for customers, there's still a short-term impact. And we've had, the federal tax credits to kind of paper that over in recent years, but those tax credits are now fully refunded. And so you are going to see at least a short-term bump in rates, and that causes a concern. So all that said, if it is least cost, if it is cheaper, we welcome that relief. The problem is there will be a bump in the short run. Rates will probably go up in the short run. And we just hope that those long-term savings properly flow back to the customers, and that it comes back to the customers, not just shareholders. So they, again, getting to the topic at hand today, they are definitely concerned about having to pay for the new generation as well as the old generation in the form of stranded assets.
Todd, do your members have clean energy goals or efficiency goals that they work with utilities to meet?
Yeah, short answer, yes. So let me break that in two parts. First, on the renewable side, as you know, on the renewable side, as mentioned earlier, sometimes the relationship of the large customers and their utilities can somewhat be tense at times, or very tense at times. They don't always get along with their utilities. And as mentioned earlier, in deregulated states, there is a lot of flexibility, a lot more flexibility and creativity for some of these renewable projects and renewable products for large customers. Before I'm canceled from any further future Customers First podcasts, I should give credit though to Scott Smith and MGE. They've done a really good job with, for example, the Renewable Energy Rider, the RER. A number of MGE's large customers, schools, colleges, governments have subscribed to the RER. It seems to be very popular, and I would expect that it will remain popular going forward. So I think that's a good example of a renewable offering, and that I think other utilities have a different flavor of it or something close, but not everybody. And I would imagine that's something that you may see a similar flavor of that going across the state over the coming years. And of course, WIG, I certainly have ideas for MGE and our utility friends across the state at the PSC later this year and in the coming years. I also say that I think you will see this year, or perhaps next year, you'll start to see some very large behind the meter solar projects. Due to confidentiality, I can't really talk about some of them right now, but I do think you are going to see very soon some large solar projects done behind the meter for some large customers. Again, not exactly sure on the timing. COVID has probably thrown a bit of a wrench into it, among other things. But I think you're going to see some large solar across the state for large customers. You mentioned efficiency as well. So not just renewables, but efficiency. On that front, I would say that focus on energy is generally fairly popular among our member companies. A number of our member companies are probably have done some of the biggest projects with focus, or biggest dollar amounts, or a number of big projects have come through a lot of my member companies. But I would say, focus is pretty popular with them, but I would really stress that they don't necessarily want to pay more for it. They don't want to pay much more than they're paying right now. So as much as it is popular, I don't think they want to pay any more than they're paying right now in contributions. But a number of my members are involved in the SEM program, Strategic Energy Management. Many of them are in the DOE Better Plants programs. So that means they're committed to really substantial energy intensity reduction goals. A number of them have sustainability goals or requirements at the corporate level. I'm very proud to say that the first ISO 50001 certified steel mill in the country and the very first ISO 50001 certified foundry in the country, pretty much the gold standard for energy management, was achieved by Charter Steel and Wapaka Foundry. So right here in Wisconsin, you got that gold standard certification for two very large energy consumers in this state. And I think I'm very proud that, two of my bigger board members have worked really hard on achieving those standards. And then finally, it's a sleeper issue, but I'm a big advocate for it. And I think, I'm not sure how many people noticed it, but waste heat recovery and waste heat to power was given the same ITC status or investment tax credit status as solar, so 26% in this last round of stimulus bill was just signed into law. And that ITC status, I think, like solar, could unlock some investment in a manufacturing state. And so a utility could, in theory, rate base one of these projects. An investor that needs tax, has a tax appetite, could be a third-party investor, but you could have utilities partnering on some of these big projects with manufacturing, and maybe that's a way of, having some peace with the utilities and large manufacturers, maybe doing a large project that some of these can be a significant number of megawatts or megawatt hours off the grid, and I'm hoping that is something that we see more of now that they achieve that ITC tax status.
Got it. Okay, Scott, is there anything you want to follow up on there?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And Todd mentioned the renewable energy rider, and thanks, Todd, for recognizing that product that we're now offering. And really, what this is this allows some of our larger customers to have more solar in their mix through a rate. And what that allows them to do is they don't have to have that capital, that upfront capital cost. They're paying for that energy through their rate. And then when they work with us, we can go out and build a larger project than they might be able to do on their own, and partner with other organizations to kind of get that scale. And then how we benefit all of the other customers is this isn't behind the meter generation. So these customers are still using our distribution grid. And so we're still charging them for that use. However, it's still a lower price than if they were to do this project on their own. That's really what that utility scale helps provide. So that's one benefit that, although we're doing these, larger scale projects, working with other utilities, working with Invenergy, we're also doing, relatively smaller projects, 10, 20 megawatt projects that are kind of designed to be more connected to our distribution.
So we talked a little bit about some of the things you're doing for large customers and some of the offerings you have. And I just, as a representative of the small customer groups, small businesses in the residential, I just wanted to see if you could just describe a little bit the bring your own device and kind of the concept that what you're thinking about in terms of helping the smaller customers save on energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're expanding our bring your own device, where basically, you can register your thermostat with us and we're going to give you $50 if you sign up your thermostat. And what we're going to do is then usually on the hottest days of the year, when energy prices are at their highest, what we're going to do is we're going to send you a text, going to say, hey, our prices are going to be high. We're going to turn your thermostat down just a few degrees. And if the customer says, wait a minute, I'm at home, I don't want you to do that, they can say, no, I don't want you to do that. They can opt out of this. However, we found that most customers, we send them that text and they go, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to be home, or I went through this last time and I didn't even realize it because we're really just moving them a degree or two. And what that does is that saves them money, but it also saves us, all of our customers, money because we aren't paying for those most expensive hours of the year. And we aren't paying the transmission demand during those most expensive hours of the year either. So it's really a cost savings for not only the customer who's participating in it, but all of our customers.
Dan, one thing I wanted to ask before we close out here, there are economic benefits that come with renewable energy projects. Can you give us an overview of some of those economic benefits?
Yes, thank you for asking. So there are long-term lease payments that go to the host landowners that are significantly larger than they can currently earn in agricultural markets. So we're seeing farmers and landowners with different scenarios, some of them switching from row crop ag to solar, some of them continuing a family row crop ag and livestock business, but diversifying some of their land to get that steady revenue stream from solar. And I think that's great because it helps keep those family farms in the family. There's significant tax benefits to the host communities, both town and county. In Wisconsin, there's a utility shared revenue state aid formula that, in a nutshell, provides $4,000 per megawatt of capacity per year to the host governments that are divided. It's like 58-42 between the county and town. So, for example, for Badger Hollow, all the land in the project now pays about $100,000 per year in property taxes. That will go to zero, but it'll be replaced by $1.2 million per year. So it's a big boost to local government. And I think that's even more important now than ever with coming out of COVID times. And then there's also a big surge in economic activity during construction. For example, right now at Badger Hollow, we have over 400 people working to build the project today. So it's not ideal with the weather conditions, but there is a big surge in construction jobs and then follow-on benefits to local businesses, restaurants, gas stations, hardware stores, stuff like that.
Thanks, Dan. All right, now it is time for the last question. If you had all the power in the energy industry for one day, what would you do with it? And I will start with you, my co-host, Tom Content.
That's a lot of power, and I've never had it. So, but that would be something. So let me just say, I think in light of COVID, I think that we at Cover paying a lot more attention on the low incomes and the folks who are struggling with their utility bills. And if I had all the power, I would recreate the system so that there's less folks who are struggling a lot less. And I we have focused so much on reliability in the state that we've got that down. But the price challenge is where we continue to have big challenges, and for many in our state, in rural and urban parts of the state, that is what I would, if I could wave a magic wand and fix something, that's what it would be.
Thanks, Tom.
For large customers, if I were king for a day or benevolent dictator, I would strengthen or expand our real-time rate options or market-based rate options. They're just absolutely critical for most of our member companies, if not almost all of them. But I think they're good for all customers. And I also think that interruptible credits should be at an appropriate level, probably raised for some utilities. I think the extreme weather of this last week is going to show the value of some of these real-time rates, interruptible credits, and other forms of demand response. I think some of the demand response was very helpful in a number of jurisdictions in Wisconsin and across MISO and other parts of the country. So I think those would be very, very valuable and should be strengthened or expanded. And finally, if I had, all the power, I would say all Wisconsin customers should once again have competitive rates for a very long period of time.
Thanks, Todd. Dan, what would you do with all the power?
If I had all the power, I would like to see a really level playing field. And I completely understand the concerns about costs, but I think that a lot of our current generation sources have unaccounted for externalities, I believe is the economics term. We presented, for example, in our Paris CPCN case, that relative to the typical Wisconsin coal-fired generation fleet, the Paris project over 30 years would reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 11.5 million tons, nitrogen oxide emissions by over 9,000 tons, sulfur dioxide emissions by over 18,000 tons, particulate matter by over 1,400 tons, and there's some other components there. And especially as we emerge from a pandemic that has consequences for our respiratory systems, I think it's really important that we understand, while the cost of solar and storage we believe is competitive now, there's other benefits that aren't really being valued as they should. And that's what I would like to see.
All right, Scott, what would you do with all the power?
Well, thanks for asking. If I had all the power, what I would do is, looking back, what we talked about in this past hour, we talked about reliability, we talked about sustainable energy resources, and we talked about cost, right? I think everybody is in agreement that we want all of those things: safe, reliable, cost-effective, and sustainable energy. But I think sometimes people come at it from just a slightly different view. And oftentimes we get caught in kind of the judicial system fighting about these things. And I believe that you can get a better solution by everyone coming together, getting locked in a room, and trying to figure out where we have these common ground and where we can move forward with these things in terms of balancing all of these things. Because, as we talked about in Texas, they don't have reliability because they have those lower costs. All of these things kind of have to come into balance. And that's where I think, working with the customer groups that Tom represents, that Todd represents, working with the renewable developers that Dan represents, I think, there are some common solutions that we can reach. But I think we just need to talk about these things together.
So you want to use your power to lock everyone in a room?
Everyone's going to get locked
All right.
in.
Thank you, Scott. We'll check into the legality of that.
I was just going to mention that don't you know we're in a pandemic and we've all been in locked rooms for a while.
Yeah, right. But yeah, and everyone's just going to turn off their Zoom, I guess,
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me.
Thanks, Kristin.
All right. Thank you so much to Tom Content for co-hosting. And thank you to all of the panelists who joined us today. And thank you again to the members of the Customers First Coalition for sponsoring our organization and our podcast. Please subscribe to The Electric Wire wherever you listen to podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And you can also rate the podcast and leave a review. Also follow along on Twitter @The Electric Wire. Thanks everyone for listening.